Indonesia banned raw ore exports, built 43 smelters, and captured 60% of global nickel output. On paper, it looks like a historic triumph of resource nationalism. But the industrial enclaves expanding across Sulawesi tell a more complicated story. One of dependency, not control. It raises a haunting question for the region. Can a nation rewrite the rules of global trade, secure tens of billions in investment, and dominate a critical mineral supply chain, yet still lose control of its own economic destiny? Act 1. The train that arrived on time. To understand how this paradox is playing out in real time, you have to travel far from the slick, air-conditioned corporate boardrooms of Jakarta. You have to place yourself directly onto the ground where this massive industrial experiment is physically happening. This is a story about the hidden friction of rapid development. It is about what happens when a state-driven economic strategy collides with local realities, shifting global markets, and the unforgiving rules of supply and demand. Consider the port town of Bahodopi in central Sulawesi. Back in 2017, it was a quiet fishing community of just 7,517 residents. Today, it is a roaring industrial boomtown of approximately 50,000 people. The transformation has been relentless. Its narrow roads are permanently jammed with heavy trucks. The air is thick with sulfur and coal smoke, and the local horizon is obscured by the dark silhouettes of waiting cargo vessels. This dramatic upheaval is the direct result of an audacious economic gamble known locally as hilirisasi or downstreaming. The underlying theory is straightforward. Indonesia would no longer function as a passive exporter of cheap, raw rocks. Instead, the government would force foreign companies to build their processing refineries directly on Indonesian soil. The goal was to capture the secondary jobs, the corporate taxes, and the lucrative processing profits that usually flow overseas. The turning point came in January 2020, when Jakarta blindsided the global commodities market by enforcing a complete ban on raw nickel ore exports. The mandate was absolute: refine it here or go without. On paper, the strategy worked spectacularly. The economic value captured soared from just $1.4 billion in 2020 to $34.8 billion by 2023. Export revenues reached $9.73 billion by 2025. That is a 109% increase in value add. But every billion on a Jakarta spreadsheet arrived in Bahodopi as another wave of migrant workers competing for beds, water, and infrastructure never built to carry them. Eager to cement this strategy as his signature legacy, President Prabowo-Gibran doubled down in early 2026. He broke ground on 13 new downstream projects worth $14 billion, targeting an aggressive growth rate of 6.5% of gross domestic product. To manage this expanding portfolio, Jakarta tasked its newly formed sovereign wealth fund, Danatasa. This state-controlled investment vehicle now directly oversees $34 billion spread across 38 strategic projects. The headline figures present an image of absolute market dominance. Yet beneath the celebratory announcements, a deep structural vulnerability has emerged. Indonesia successfully built a massive industrial monument to its future, but the blueprint belongs almost entirely to someone else. By relying exclusively on external capital to construct its processing backbone, the state traded its raw material dependency for a far more complex, refined form of economic reliance. Act 2. The foundations of a refined dependency. As the scale of this external reliance becomes visible, the physical structures rising above the Sulawesi coastline are staggering in their proportions. Yet the core engineering, the operational control, and the financial architecture supporting these complexes do not originate from within Indonesia. They are part of a broader geopolitical play mapping back to the Asian mainland. The speed of construction has been unprecedented. In 2014, the entire Indonesian archipelago housed just 2 operational nickel smelters. By 2023, that number had exploded to 43, creating Asia's largest nickel processing hub. At the center of this boom sits the Morowali Industrial Park, a massive 4,000-hectare enclave employing over 120,000 workers. But look at who actually owns it. Over 90% of these 43 smelters are owned, constructed, and operated by state-aligned Chinese corporations. This was not a casual investment. Under Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese industrial giants poured $30 billion directly into Indonesian nickel facilities, with broader supply chain commitments reaching $65 billion. This was a strategic relocation of industrial overcapacity. Facing slowing growth and tightening regulatory constraints at home, Chinese firms moved their capital-intensive smelting assets directly to Southeast Asia to lock down critical raw materials at the source. This arrangement has created an intense structural imbalance on the factory floor. Look at the hierarchy. 90% of the workforce consists of local Indonesian citizens, but they are almost entirely confined to raw heavy labor. Meanwhile, the top 10% consists of Chinese technicians and engineers who control the specialized machinery, the proprietary metallurgical processes, and the operational data. The local workforce provides the muscle. The foreign apparatus retains the intellectual property. This stark disparity is exactly what independent domestic economists like the late Faisal Basri of the Institute for Development of Economics and Finance had warned about. Basri showed that these downstreaming hubs operate essentially as economic enclaves. The mineral wealth gets processed locally, yes, but the specialized components, the high-value machinery, and the ultimate profits get funneled directly back into foreign industrial supply chains. Indonesia did not break its dependence. It merely refined it. Act 3. The price of absolute dominance. But structural dependency was only the first hidden cost. The second lesson was a harsh reminder of basic market economics. Flood the world with a commodity, and you destroy its price. By forcing global capital to build smelters at breakneck speed, Jakarta inadvertently triggered a massive supply shock, one that would reverberate through its own industrial corridor. Indonesia's production share rocketed to 60.2% of global output. That is a level of concentration no single producer has ever held in the history of the mineral trade. This tidal wave of supply completely overwhelmed global demand. London Metal Exchange nickel prices collapsed from $20,000 per metric ton to between $14,150 and $15,500 by late 2025. For Morowali workers, that price crash meant overtime quietly disappeared and bonuses never materialized. Jakarta had successfully cornered the market, but the market it won was rapidly bleeding value. The financial shockwaves quickly destabilized the operators themselves. In mid-2024, Chinese steel giant Jiangsu Dilong declared bankruptcy under the weight of crashing margins. Its high-profile Indonesian subsidiary PT Gunbuster Nickel Industry faced total shutdown by early 2025. To prevent a wider collapse, state-aligned Chinese entities stepped in to absorb Dilong's assets. The ownership changed hands, but it remained firmly within Chinese state control. Jakarta remained a mere bystander to the restructuring of its own industrial backbone. Desperate to stop the price freefall, Jakarta scrambled to restrict supply. For 2026, the government slashed national nickel ore mining quotas to between 260 million and 270 million tons. The 2025 target had been 379 million tons. That is a cut of 31%, and it created a brutal unintended domestic squeeze. The aggressive quota cuts starved local smelters of feedstock. Domestic saprolite premiums spiked to 60% above government floor prices. This led to a bizarre twist of economic irony. Indonesian smelters, built specifically to process Indonesian ore, were forced to begin importing raw feedstock from the Philippines. The Philippines, which never banned exports, happily pocketed the premium, shipping record volumes of raw ore to feed the massive, starving Chinese-owned factories sitting across the sea in Indonesia. Act 4. The carbon wall and the Great Tech Pivot. Even if Indonesia manages to stabilize domestic nickel prices, it now faces two structural threats that no amount of resource nationalism can fix. The entire strategy is running directly into a geopolitical lockout in the West and a rapid, unexpected shift in global battery chemistry. The first barrier is environmental. To power these massive electricity-hungry smelting complexes on remote islands, Chinese investors built dedicated captive coal-fired power stations. Because of this heavy reliance on cheap coal, Indonesian nickel now carries one of the highest carbon intensity profiles in the world. Under the United States Inflation Reduction Act, electric vehicles using minerals processed by what Washington calls foreign entities of concern lose access to Western tax credits. With no bilateral trade agreement with Washington and Chinese capital dominating the sector, Indonesian nickel is effectively locked out of the premium Western supply chain. Western industrial giants quickly read the writing on the wall. In June 2024, German chemical producer BASF and French mining group Eramet abruptly cancelled their planned $2.6 billion Sonic Bay refinery project at Weda Bay. The official reason given was global market oversupply, but the underlying message was undeniable. The carbon footprint and geopolitical risks of Indonesian nickel had become too toxic for Western corporate balance sheets to carry. Meanwhile, the physical expansion of the mines continues to extract a severe domestic environmental toll. At Weda Bay, expanding nickel concessions are encroaching directly on the rainforest territory of the uncontacted nomadic Honggana Meniawa tribe. This creates a painful, visible contradiction. It pits the global narrative of a green energy transition directly against the immediate survival of an ancient indigenous culture. But the sharper blow to the long-term strategy is happening inside global research labs. For years, the auto industry assumed that electric vehicles absolutely required nickel-rich chemistry to achieve viable driving ranges. That consensus evaporated. By 2025, lithium iron phosphate batteries, which use zero nickel and zero cobalt, dropped to $81 per kilowatt hour. Nickel-based packs cost $128. The new chemistry proved cheap, stable, and safer. The commercial market shifted with stunning speed. By late 2025, these nickel-free LFP batteries captured 81.2% of China's domestic electric vehicle market and are now approaching half of global capacity. For Morowali families, a boardroom decision in Shenzhen arrives in Sulawesi as a missed pay cycle, a plant idling its furnaces instead of running double shifts. The auto industry is rapidly pivoting away, threatening to leave Indonesia's multi-billion-dollar smelting complexes as stranded, obsolete assets. This shift exposes the high stakes of resource dependency. Indonesia poured its capital into coal-fired infrastructure, betting on permanent global demand for nickel-heavy batteries. That bet is now looking shaky. As alternative technologies advance, the risk grows that these massive facilities become obsolete before they pay for themselves. It shows how quickly global innovation can outrun a developing nation's fixed industrial policy. Act 5. The mineral trap. This brings us to the deeper implication. Escaping the historical role of a primary raw material exporter is a major milestone, but it does not automatically guarantee economic sovereignty. Moving one step down the value chain can sometimes simply mean inheriting a different set of global constraints. Look at the structural breakdown. Processing raw ore into nickel pig iron is a low-margin, high-pollution activity. Indonesia's gross national income per capita stood at just $4,810 in 2023, far below the World Bank high-income threshold of $13,935. For the worker in Bahodopi, that gap is the difference between a wage that covers rent and one that does not. Without the domestic capability to manufacture the actual high-value batteries or the vehicles themselves, the country remains trapped in a lower tier of the supply chain it cannot control. This tension reached a boiling point in May 2026. Frustrated by sudden regulatory shifts, the China Chamber of Commerce in Indonesia took the extraordinary step of bypassing normal channels, sending a direct protest letter to President Prabowo. They warned that tax hikes, mining quota cuts, and rampant corruption were creating crippling business conditions that threatened their operating margins. It was a stark reminder. When a developing nation relies entirely on foreign capital to build its industrial base, the investors eventually expect to dictate how the country is run. In a direct bid to counter these transfer pricing risks and reclaim control from foreign entities, Jakarta established a new state agency called PT Danatasa Indonesia on May 25, 2026. This body is tasked with directly overseeing, auditing, and regulating strategic resource exports. It is a bold structural move, but the clock is ticking against the rapidly shifting global market. Meanwhile, the ultimate cost of this grand industrial experiment is carried by the local population. Consider Elon, a local smelter worker in Morowali. In December 2023, he suffered severe second-degree burns during a catastrophic furnace explosion at the PT ITSS facility. The accident claimed 21 lives and wounded 38 others. In the aftermath, Elon received an initial medical compensation payment of just 3 million rupiah, equivalent to about $190. The ground-level arithmetic of hilirisasi looks like Mulyati, the wife of an unemployed Morowali smelter worker. Following production cuts at a nearby plant, she washes laundry for neighbors at 25,000 rupiah, roughly $1.50 per load. She is struggling to repay a commercial loan for a motorcycle her family can no longer afford to fuel. Indonesia told the world that it would no longer sell its raw materials cheap. It successfully built the factories, dug the mines, and dominated the global supply. But as the market pivots away and foreign capital protects its own margins, Jakarta is left with a burning environmental footprint and a sobering realization. It is incredibly difficult to own the future when someone else owns the technology. The challenges facing Indonesia's nickel strategy reflect a broader regional struggle for economic autonomy in a technology-driven world. These global supply chains demand more than raw resources. They demand technological sovereignty. I am Hero the Hornbill, and this is the ASEAN Angle. If this episode gave you a new way of seeing the region, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. New episodes weekly, link in the description.